Hello, my name is Durga Singer, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Michigan in pediatric endocrinology and molecular and integrative physiology. As a member of the Women Inspiring and Elevating Leadership in Diabetes Board, it is my pleasure to introduce this video interview. Given that women are underrepresented in leadership positions in diabetes and metabolism fields, we as a community of professionals in the fields of diabetes, obesity, and metabolism have come together to advocate and support women. One of our goals is to empower and encourage women in the field, and part of this includes providing resources and knowledge for individuals to develop their own leadership abilities, but also change the trend and create equitable leadership in the field. In this video, Dr. Barbara Corkey, Professor of Medicine and Vice Chair of Research at Boston University in the Department of Medicine, interviews Dr. David Coleman, Chair of the Department of Medicine at Boston University. Dr. Coleman has increased women in leadership, and we are excited that he is sharing his perspective on leadership with us. This video is in two parts, with the first describing understanding keys to support diverse faculty as they advance in their careers, and part two focused on the importance of work-life considerations, peer mentorship, accountability, why leaders need to learn how to follow, and the importance of diversity. We hope you enjoy this two-part series. And for more information about WIELD or resources, please head to our webpage.
Well, I'm Barbara Corkey, and I'm here to interview Dr. David Coleman, who is chair of the Department of Medicine at Boston University, and who I know because I was vice chair for research for a period of time. And during that time, our department went from having one woman in a position of importance and power and leadership to now, I think yesterday I did a rough count, there are 15 of us. And this is in a period of about 12 years. So that's a very impressive change. And it has all been done by Dr. Coleman. And so the interview today is to try and help us at WIELD understand what can happen and what helps us to achieve leadership positions. And I would like to start by asking Dr. Coleman to broadly discuss leadership, and then we'll move on to other specific questions. So can you please briefly describe your leadership positions and what you've learned about leadership?
Sure. Well, thank you, Barbara, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to chat with you and your group. I appreciate it. I think as I reflect on my career, I've been very blessed to have a number of leadership positions. I was a section chief in infectious disease for a number of years. I was a chief of medicine in a VA, and then interim chair of the Department of Medicine at Yale for 4 years, or just under 4 years, prior to coming here in 2006. So for roughly the last 28 plus years, I've been a chair of medicine, now in my third institution. As I think about my own experience, I feel that, I've been very fortunate to have the positions that I've had. I've loved every job I've had in academic medicine, from the first day of my faculty position, where I was primarily an investigator, to today. So I feel quite privileged. I think what I've learned about leadership, and maybe we'll talk more about this in depth in subsequent questions, is I've first learned that leadership is above all else a frame of mind, not a position. So I think we've all known leaders who were in leadership positions who didn't lead very effectively. And we've also known people who didn't have fancy leadership titles who led and influenced the group around them. So I think first is I've recognized that it's very much a frame of mind in how you see yourself and your interactions with those around you. Second, I've learned that leadership is learnable, that they're the most effective leaders, and certainly been a very important lesson for me, is are people who are inquisitive and who learn on the job. There's a great number of aspects of leadership that I think one can both prepare for and also learn as you do it. I've also learned that the best leaders need to learn how to be effective followers. And this notion of followership, I think, is one that's a little bit understated. We all have bosses. I've had many, many bosses along the way, and they've been very different from one another. They've had a unique set of sensibilities and vulnerabilities and capacity, and understanding them as individuals has helped me be more effective in my role as a leader and representing the interests of the departments that I've led. And lastly, I think, being in a leadership position gives you a unique opportunity to learn a lot about yourself. And I've discovered capacity in myself that I didn't know I had. I've also had the sort of brutal realization that I'm not very good at some things, and I am not as self-aware as I wish I was. And those have been important life lessons that have helped me in my relationships in my family and with other people as well as professionally. The practical challenge of leadership positions I've found, though, is that there's no volume setting. When I was doing research, I could pretty much control the tempo of the day or the week or the month. And as a leader, you're always on if that's your primary responsibility. And so my ability to control that volume has been less than I imagined it would be. But overall, I want to leave you with the sense that I feel quite blessed to have had the responsibilities that I've had.
So I think we're quite blessed as well to have had you as a leader. And I'm particularly curious about what factors influenced you in promoting women in leadership positions and creating this enormous change.
Well, I think I would frame it in terms of how to achieve diversity and why to achieve a diversity within an organization. And I think clearly there's a moral responsibility to do so. But I think there's also a very practical imperative, which is that organizations that are more diverse and present people of different lived experiences and perspectives and backgrounds are higher performing. So it was pretty clear to me, and I think this is broadly the case now, or much more broadly the case now, that we recognize that if we have more diverse perspectives in leadership roles, we're going to be a better department, and we're going to more fully represent the society that we ultimately are accountable to. I also will tell you that one of the very important formative experiences for me has been being married to a woman who has a academic medical career, and seeing her insights and seeing her experiences has been incredibly influential for me. And then also having two daughters who are in medicine, one's in academic medicine, one is still training, and seeing their experiences and the barriers and the possibilities that they've experienced along the way has been really eye-opening for me.
It's fantastic. Okay, so what steps can women take, do you think, to prepare themselves for leadership positions, to be ready when the opportunities arise?
Well, it's a very important question, Barbara. I think the first is to be very clear-eyed about what you want from your career, and to be as honest as you can be about what's motivating you. If you want a leadership position because somehow you believe that's how you measure success, I think you'll be less fulfilled in the position than if you can really look as carefully as possible at the intrinsic aspects of the position and discover parts of it that you think would be meaningful for you. So I think first is to be clear on your motivation and to be realistic about what gets you excited. And you may come to the conclusion that today is not the right day or right time for you to become a leader, but down the road, it may be. And I think it's that transition point when you're ready to focus less on your own achievements and to feel comfortable with and embrace a role where you worry about and encourage the accomplishments of other people. And that transition to a more selfless approach to your career occurs at different times for different people. And some people never get there. But I think being as honest with yourself about that timing is really important. And second is, I think, to realize that there are some incredibly rewarding parts of leadership, but there's some really difficult parts. Leaders, and I certainly feel this way, and I felt this way a few minutes ago when you were introducing me, leaders get more credit than they deserve, but they also get more blame than they deserve. And thinking about how are you going to feel about that? You can't have the good without the bad. So how is that going to impact you? And how prepared are you to depersonalize some of the inputs you get and some of the feedback you get while still hearing it carefully so that you can grow and evolve as a leader? Then I think there's clearly some learnable skills that would help prepare folks for leadership positions. I tend to think about 3 core competency areas for leaders that I have informed my own thinking about my own skill development. One is around the content. What content do you need to know to be effective in a or the leadership position? Do I need to know about finance? Do I need to know about negotiations, about organizational development? Do I need to know about human resource issues? Do I need to know how academic health systems work? So first is content. Second, I think is character. And I think it's pretty obvious that that leaders who are trusted are leaders who are much more effective. And the corollary there is that distrusted leaders or mistrusted leaders are not effective. So being intentional about saying what you mean and meaning what you say, talking the talk and walking the walk, being the same person, no matter who you're talking to, and devoting attention to your own trustworthiness, I think is really important. And then the third area is thinking in a disciplined way about the domains of emotional intelligence, where I think there's the awareness domains of self-awareness and social awareness. How do you develop those skills? There's some evidence that one can build one's emotional intelligence skills. And then thinking about how do you manage yourself and how do you manage others? So I think emotional intelligence is a really important determinant of success as a leader. But I think I'd come back to the key point of having clarity about the why. Why do you want to do it? And devoting some time and energy to thinking about that and talking to other people about it can be really helpful.
See, you've answered my next question, which is what should people do to prepare themselves for leadership? And but you also said something that to me in the past, that there's no risk-free path to leadership. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think this is also a little bit understated as one of the domains of leadership experiences. In order to be an effective leader, I think you have to develop your leadership skills and your management skills. And most of us are better at one than the other. And simply put, I think good managers do things right and good leaders do the right things. And so I think thinking in a disciplined way about both leadership and management is really, really helpful. And I think getting clear that you can't be effective as a leader unless you're willing to take some risks. And some of those risks are the ambiguities in certain choices. That is, you can't be certain about which is the right thing to do. And you have to, I think, develop some comfort with that ambiguity. If you wait for certainty, you won't really take the kind of risks to help you and the organization really evolve. And then I think related there is one's ability to take risks is often related to how you feel about yourself in the role. And this is where I think many of us are challenged around the imposter syndrome, the sense that, boy, if I'm in that role, I'm not sure anybody knows how unprepared I am or how ill-suited I am for that position. And all of us have some element of imposter syndrome. And I think calling that out and recognizing the universality of that, and then trying to think about, well, what triggers it in me? And how do I get beyond that? I remember vividly walking, I sort of grew up in my formative years at Yale. And I remember just having incredible respect for the chair of medicine and for actually a couple of the chairs of medicine. And I remember walking into the auditorium where I was going to be announced as the interim chair of the Department of Medicine. And I felt like an imposter. I felt, how can I compare myself to this person that I held in such esteem? And, I just put one foot in front of the other and, tried to do it. So I think getting comfortable taking risks that you might not be successful, you won't please everybody all the time, that your good intentions won't necessarily lead to good outcomes, that there's going to be things that you're really bad at, and a lot of your deficiencies in the laboratory or doing research are private deficiencies. Maybe you and the reviewer know, but when you transition into a leadership position, your deficiencies are now public and everybody knows, and it feels really different.
Fantastic. Okay, what advice would you give about negotiating for a leadership position?
So really important question. So I think as with any negotiation, being as prepared as you can be for the negotiation is critical. Whether you're talking about your own salary, whether you're talking about, quote, what to ask for beyond just your personal compensation, doing your homework is vitally important. And the people you're going to be leading are depending on you to do the homework. So I would say your responsibilities start before you start in the role, and recognizing that doing that homework will be something you'll have to do continuously in the role, but it's particularly important to do it up front before you negotiate. Secondly, I think deciding where you are on the spectrum of I'm indifferent about whether I get this job or this role to I've got to have it. I'm so excited about this. Where are you in that perspective, in that spectrum? And that will influence how you react to the various offerings and what you actually hold out for. Third is try not to be seduced by the superficial aspects of I'm being considered for a leadership position. Try to be as clear-eyed about that as possible, because many people are more excited about being the job than doing the job. And I remember when I was first offered a leadership position, I was pretty excited about the fact I was being offered a leadership position. And I was so grateful that I don't think I really negotiated in quite as effective a way. as in subsequent leadership positions. And then I think one in terms of your own personal package, I think recognizing that there are financial aspects that affect you personally, like your salary, and remember that compensation and salary are not the same. So I look back on my own salary negotiations and I just thought about a number. I didn't think about all the other parts of compensation, like health insurance and retirement and all that. So thinking about that is important. And then thinking about sort of the finances of the environment around you that would help you be successful. And then I think another important strategy in negotiations is to take your time, to recognize you don't have to get to yes in that first or second conversation. Things will always occur to you after the conversation that you wish you had thought of or brought up. Give yourself the opportunity to do that. And then if you get stuck, I think saying, well, what if 2 years from now, our department achieves X, or my section or my unit or my center achieves X? Will you then feel good about investing additional resources in my program that I'm leading?
Yes.
So creating a sense that you want some performance incentives that would recognize success and create additional and trigger additional investments. Someone once told me that for chairs, the first day is your best day. And that after that, you just attrit your recruitment package. So having some opportunities for a second or even a third wave of additional resources predicated on achieving certain goals is really helpful.
Yeah, that's fantastic ideas. In fact, I think it's important to have what you need to do the job that you envision. So, yes. Okay, so the next question is, what has been the impact of having so many women now in leadership positions in our department?
Well, I think, I think it's had several important positives. Number one, very practically, we've had people like you who were not in previous leadership positions in the department, who now have access and have brought incredibly important perspectives to the table. Second, I think it's made our department more interesting and more fun to have women in the leadership roles. Third is we now have role models for women in training in our department or junior faculty.
Yes.
And I have been really struck by how many people have told me how much they admire the women leaders in the department. And that's coming from women faculty. And that's a gift of those leaders to those faculty. I think that's really important. The other thing that it's done is, and I think I probably underestimated this, is it's created a much broader array of sponsorship in the department. Women leaders in the department have done a particularly effective job of sponsoring other faculty for national positions, for local and national awards. And they see people in the department that I think I wouldn't necessarily see, or others wouldn't necessarily see. And that's been one of the benefits of having a more diverse leadership team. And I don't think I really, going into it, recognized that, but it's been striking. And that's, it sort of builds on itself because of that. It's also been more fun for me. Some of the women leaders, including you that I've worked with, have told me things about myself that I was shocked to hear, but were actually very helpful. Shocked to hear in the sense that I didn't think I I was acting the way I was acting. And it was hard to hear it, but it was absolutely necessary. And it was a gift.
Well, I think you gave us a gift in being totally honest back. And that allowed us to have a relationship where, you could say to me or I could say to you, whatever directly what we felt.
Mhm.
I think this is a very unusual situation. Is
Yeah,
that
perhaps
part,
so.
is that part of leadership or is that just personality?
Well, I think, I would say it's part of this character domain that we talked about. I think creating a leadership environment in which you get the best advice, regardless of whether you want to hear it or it flatters you or whatever, it's so important. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter if you say, Barbara, I want your honest opinion about this.
Mhm.
I've learned that that's kind of empty because everybody says that. You don't. I wouldn't say to you, Barbara, I want your dishonest opinion. What matters is how you respond when you give me your honest opinion.
Right.
And if I welcome that, or if I think hard about that, you're going to do it again. And I think that's an important form of generativity for leaders is to think about it's your actions, not what you say. And I think that's part of this character domain that where you have to build trust with people.
Okay. So what do you think holds women back from taking leadership positions or going after them?
Really important. And it's hard for me to answer that without overgeneralizing. So I'm going to ask for absolution in advance. I think there's both extrinsic and intrinsic factors. I think the extrinsic factors are gender bias, which is all around us, obviously. Second, I think women are held to a different standard in leadership positions than men. The kinds of assertiveness, levels of assertiveness in male leaders, I think are handled differently or tolerated differently than from female leaders. We are fortunate here to have female leaders of both the school and the health system. And I see both of them held to a different standard of behavior. I think the intrinsic factors are that I think hold people back is one, I think, is time. I mean, I think in general that women, particularly women with children, tend to do relatively more of the child rearing activities than their husbands do, their spouses do. And it's, I think that puts time pressure. I see that particularly in my own personal experience and with my daughter now, who's in her mid to late 30s and has a young family and an academic position. She's fortunately married to someone who really shares equally, I think. So I think that's been helpful to her. But I think time is the issue. I think also I think one of the things that holds women back is, and this was, I think, taught to me by some of our faculty from underrepresented groups. What they explained to me is these were African-American faculty, they feel that if they fail, they have failed African-American faculty coming up behind them.
Right.
And I think women have some of the same pressures.
Right.
They've explained that to me. If I fail as a woman leader, it's going to be a while before this department has another woman leader.
Right.
I can tell you with certainty that I never once have thought that if I failed, they'll never appoint another man. That is
so true.
I have never had that burden.
Right.
And I think that
It's
that that holds people back.
Yeah.
And I also think that, we all have imposter syndrome, but I think imposter syndrome is worn differently at times by women than men. I don't want to overgeneralize too much, but I think that is in play. And I think the other thing that holds women back is there's not that many role models to look to. That's starting to change now, but I think that is a practical, important aspect, and it gets back to this sponsorship question.
Right. And then the next question is, I think, a little bit related, and that is, how can we advocate for consideration of diverse candidates, including women, in our leadership and in general?
Yeah, really important. I think the organization has to decide, is diversity really important or not? And if so, why? Is it just because it sounds good, or is there really a strong conviction that that's how organizational success is going to be measured and evaluated? Secondly, I think process matters. So I think having leadership positions always be advertised, as opposed to appointing my male friends to the position. So any funded position in our department, we try very hard to always make it available to as broad a group as we can. Sometimes we only advertise internally, depending on the position, and other times we go, outside. But I think process does matter. And I think you have to inspect what you expect. And it's very easy to say, well, we've got 2 female leaders of our respective organizations. I think you can appoint women to leadership positions and say, we've got this issue nailed.
Right.
And we have had 2 longstanding female leaders of our organization, and we have a lot of gender issues within our organization. So I think you have to always assume that inequities are going to pop up. You can't be reassured by numbers. You can't be reassured today that it's going to be the same as tomorrow. Complacency is the enemy. And if your environment is not one that supports people of diverse backgrounds and welcomes them, you're not going to take full advantage of what diversity has to offer. So there's a lot of complexities to it.
Well, I've noticed also that there have been women I'm aware of that behave as badly as men once they get into leadership positions. How do you handle? And then, of course, that makes for a bad reputation for women. And it's also viewed differently than if a male behaves in that manner.
Yeah. And just, I think one of the reasons that I suspect many women worry about their own success affecting other women is when a woman or a minority is not viewed positively, there is an impact on other women.
Right.
Whereas if I behave badly, there's very little impact on other men. It's,
right.
I'm just falling short. So there's not I think, similar treatment. But you're right that there's nothing that says that because you're a certain background, you're going to be a successful leader. And that really gets to those domains of leadership and thinking about leadership as learnable.
Okay, now this is another issue I think that many women are concerned about, and that is that women, and especially in earlier days, and individuals from underrepresented groups are often disproportionately tapped for service, for teaching, for committees, for advising. how do you strategize to help women balance their lives in such a way that they don't ultimately do harm?
Yeah, this is a really good question, Barbara. I think, and I'll give you maybe an excessively nuanced answer. I think people who take on everything they're asked to do are making a mistake. And I think people who say no to everything are making a mistake. So just want to point that out up front. So I think when you enter a new job or a new role, it's really important to recognize that you're going to encounter opportunities that you didn't encounter previously. So having some part of your effort and time and emotional and intellectual energy accessible to these new opportunities is important. And learning from being on committees, learning in taking on interim roles, learning in participating in search committees, or these are all learning opportunities. And I think being disciplined about recognizing that's part of your own growth and development, while not doing so much of it that it diverts you from your primary focus, is where the sweet spot is. It's also the case that the answer may be different at different parts of your career and at even different months of the year. And being nimble enough to toggle your willingness to serve up and down, depending on other distractions and circumstances, is really important. I think people tend to err on the side of saying yes to these opportunities. And I think that's, I've generally done that in my career, and I've learned an enormous amount. I've had about half a dozen different interim jobs, over the course of my career, and they were really educational and an important part of my own development, even though I didn't stay in them.
So the education part of it can outweigh sometimes the disadvantages.
Yes.
That's right. Okay, how can leaders be more effective mentors and sponsors for women?
Well, I think one is to not presume that you know what women want or minorities want, or frankly, any individual wants.
Right.
We have a tendency, I think, in our enthusiasm to help people to assume they want what we have or we did or whatever. And that's not always the case. So I think starting out being very inquisitive, what's important? Where do you want to be? What do you think your strengths are? What do you think your weaknesses are?
Right.
What do you think, what do you want out of your career now and maybe in the future? What are the forces that are influencing you outside of work? And I think you can't really adequately mentor people until you have a broad understanding of those things. And second, I think, and this is in my formative years in academics, mentoring was very hierarchical. And I went to the wise, usually white male, who mentored and sponsored me and kind of told me what to do. Now I think people are much smarter about mentorship. They seek peer mentors. They seek hierarchical mentors. They have, I think, more mentoring communities. And I think setting women up in particular to interact with other peer women is really helpful. And I would make that generalization about minorities and other, broad categories of faculty. I think establishing a sense of community is really important and often leads to mentorship and sponsorship. So I think leaders can be more inquisitive. They can realize that people need more than one mentor, and that young people are looking for different things from their mentors than when I was young, or when we were young, and respecting those generational differences and not griping about them is pretty helpful.
So I noticed that two of the women who you promoted in our department have taken on roles that didn't exist at all, that I never would have imagined existed. And somehow you were sensitive enough, or however it happened, I don't know. I think of the faculty development area that we never had before. And somehow you allowed a person with a passion for this to go that way. And the other is our ARCs, bringing people together. So how did you know to do that?
Well,
I was surprised that happened.
So I think I was more attracted to the concept of having a faculty development and diversity program when I started than I was a particular candidate or phenotype. I didn't come to that decision quickly. In my previous role, I thought all section chiefs, all leaders should develop their faculty. And why would you segregate out that activity among, a small group or a single person or a single program within the department? I realized that was not a good way to think about it. That was probably not right. And that's what gave rise shortly after I came to changing that perspective. So that sort of evolved out of a sense that we really had to invest in human capital, if you will, and that there were some creative ways to do it, and we weren't doing them. And so then we had a search for a leader of that, and 3 senior women applied. Interestingly, no men applied for that position.
Okay.
And we had a selection committee, and they picked Amelia Benjamin, who's established, I think, one of the best faculty development programs I've ever seen.
Every department should have one.
Everyone should have.
Exactly.
And same with you and I talked about interdisciplinary research and how important that was. And
the idea is great, but
and then you
did it.
Then you have a search, and you end up with a really good person who's committed to it. And we were blessed to have Katja Ravid lead that effort.
Right. Okay. Where do leaders fail? And any lessons for women considering leadership positions?
So there are all sorts of ways leaders fail. I guess, they fail in as many ways as we fail as human beings. But I think there's a few themes that I've seen. One is, I think people don't recognize the importance and the interdependence of leadership and management. They focus more on one side than the other. I've known really good managers who weren't effective leaders, and good leaders who were really ineffective managers. Mm-hmm. And you pay a price if it's either or. So I think being mindful of the need to excel in each area and training yourself and getting feedback and being disciplined about those 2 areas is important. Second is a very common reason people fail in academics is not holding people accountable, not setting standards and enforcing standards. And I think the very best people in an organization like a Department of Medicine want the department to be outstanding and want the leaders to enforce standards. And that if there is misbehavior or unprofessional behavior or impactful underperformance, they expect their leaders to call that out and to do something about it. So I think leaders that shy away from that, and there are a lot of reasons we don't, those are unpleasant things to do, and nobody wants to, hopefully nobody takes a leadership role so they can hold people accountable. It's not number 1 on your priority list. But even deans and hospital CEOs were asked, why do department chairs fail, among the health system leaders, they didn't hold their people accountable. That wasn't the number one from dean's perspectives, but I think it's the accountability issue that is difficult. And I think, and this is something I've struggled with, is I think making your expectations clear is often where we fall short. And I have a tendency to assume that if you take the vice chair of research job, you know what research is, you know what greatness looks like, you know, and I don't need to say, Barbara, here's the 5 things that I expect of you in the role. And here, I want you to know that these are the 5 things you can expect of me in helping you in the role. I've gotten to that point, but I was very slow to that party, very slow to recognize the importance of setting expectations. I think the last is, and I see this all the time, is people very perplexed and upset because their good intentions didn't lead to a good outcome. Mm-hmm. And that sense of hurt that people have, they often migrate out of their leadership roles because they feel hurt. And they, understandably wish their good intentions were used to judge them, not the outcomes. And I do the same thing. So I have great sympathy for that.
So moving almost to the end now, how can women be more effective followers?
Well, I think a couple things. One, it's important to call out that being at followership is an important part of leadership, and that you can start learning to be a good follower before you have a leadership position, and continue to be an effective follower as a leader. Given that all of us have bosses, I think devoting time to thinking about how do I help my bosses succeed? What are their measures of success? How can I disagree with them effectively? What are their vulnerabilities? What sets them off? How do they communicate most effectively? I've had bosses, for example, that communicate really poorly by email. And the same person communicates much more effectively in person. And so I've learned, the hard way not to rely on email with that. So I would say studying your leaders, understanding what pressures they're under, understanding as much as you can about them as human beings and how they see their own success can help you both in framing issues and in helping them be successful, because if they're successful, they're much more likely to want your department or your organization to be successful. So I think thinking about this principle of how you manage up is an important part of being an effective leader.
Great. And now our last question is, how can we foster leadership recalibration to include women and underrepresented people in general's strengths, which may be different from the standard all-white male leadership?
Yeah, well, I think this kind of fundamentally gets to how you evaluate excellence and how you think about what forms of excellence diverse perspectives bring to an organization. And I think being thoughtful about perspectives and experiences that people with different backgrounds bring to a role is a form of excellence and helps the organizations be more successful. And I think, frankly, helps you as a leader be more effective. So I think, this often gets entangled in the affirmative action debate. And I think it's, it sort of defies simple generalizations and simple explanations. I think recognizing that diversity is an important component of organizational success, that there's a moral imperative to do it. If you fail to do it, you are not only depriving the institution, but you're probably also discriminating against important groups.
Right.
And so I think being clear about the why you're doing it makes a huge difference when you get to the how are you going to do it. And I don't think organizations talk enough explicitly about the why.
Fantastic. Well, I think we can open this now to questions from our audience, if there should be any.
That was incredibly comprehensive. So I don't have a question, but perhaps some of my colleagues do.
I just had a question. You had mentioned earlier on in the information you were giving about the importance of emotional intelligence and connecting with understanding your own skill set that you're coming towards leadership with. And I'm curious how, taking the time to think about that is really, really hard sometimes. I'm curious how you found the time to do that, or if there were specific trainings that you engaged in to kind of build your leadership skills.
Well, I think, there were several steps. One is I began to recognize how important it was and how powerful it was. And I think I made some, I would say, some pretty impressive mistakes that helped me recognize my limitations of self-awareness. I also had the great gift of working with people who really said to me, you think you're this way, but you're really that way. And that shook me to my core. I made the mistake of saying to my spouse, you won't believe what I heard today. I heard that someone told me I wasn't this way and that I was really that way. And she said, I don't have a clue what surprised you about that. So I realized that I probably had some learning to do. And I think the other thing that helped me candidly was we decided to have leadership training for our faculty and our residents in our internal medicine residency program. And I participated in that and did a lot of reading about emotional intelligence and recognized that, the proponents and experts in the field have strategies to enhance your ability. But I think calling it out and recognizing that you really can't be effective unless you're both aware and capable of self-management and managing others, managing your own equanimity and your own feelings in social environments, really, really important. So I think I'd love to tell you that it was a lightning bolt revelation, but it was mostly a lot of mistakes.
That's really helpful to hear. Thank you.
Good question. You talked about how leadership is a frame of mind and how it is learnable, but we have to start somewhere. So I'm wondering if there are traits that you look for in junior people where you think, if they just had a little bit of training, they could be amazing.
Yes, really good question. So I look for several things. One is I think leaders need to be generative. And part of being generative is creating a sense of possibility and optimism. So leaders who are pessimistic do not inspire. And so I think having people who lean into life, who lean into possibility is a really important attribute. Second is people who listen effectively, who listen and learn, who adapt and are nimble, as opposed to people who are the loudest voice in the room and are just particularly prone to or good at advocating for their own perspective. And I think also having people who are passionate about achievement, who have a sense of aspiration, who want to make things better. These are all kind of obvious attributes, but they can get overlooked at times. And I think they end up being determining as to whether someone is successful. And I do tend to gravitate towards people who I think have, emotional intelligence, and at least have those, the beginnings of those awareness and management skills that I think are pretty important. But I think having people who really are effective communicators and who are passionate and who like working with different groups of people, particularly in settings like ours that are so interdependent and so complex, is really important. But I would say, as I've looked back, and I've had reason to do so recently on my career, I would say that what young prospective leaders have brought so much to me is a sense of possibility and a sense of aspiration. And that's very energizing. And I think, I at times can get cynical and to see the challenges more clearly than I can see the possibilities. And I'm continually energized by people in the earlier stages of their careers.
As I'm sitting here, Dr. Coleman, I wish I had had you as a leader and a mentor my entire career. And many of us on this call today are sort of mid-career. And you touched on this a little bit with the idea of managing up. I've had to manage up a little bit to some very difficult leaders. And, if you in 2 or 3 sentences could impart some wise advice for those of us that have had challenges in terms of managing up, no matter sort of what's your gender, what's your race or ethnicity, difficult leaders are difficult leaders. What is your sort of quick advice for those of us that have experienced difficulties in managing up?
Yeah, well, my bosses would tell you that you're probably asking the wrong person. But I would say a couple of things. One, really try hard not to personalize, because if they're being a bad leader towards you, they're probably being a bad leader towards others. So trying very hard not to let their foibles diminish you is really important. Second is to try as hard as you can to understand the pressures they're under and to see their good qualities, even though at times their negatives can really dominate. And the third is to, and this depends a lot on who they are and how I think, finding ways to ask how you can help, flipping the tables around a little bit to assist them in their position. Sometimes that's really hard to do because you have your own anger and disappointment and hurt that you're bringing into the conversation. And I certainly have had all of those feelings, but I think that's how I would think about it in maybe a hopelessly succinct way.
I have one quick question, Dr. Coleman. That was all fantastic. And this was a really rich interview and I've learned so much. A lot of what you talked about, was self-reflecting on qualities of leadership and where strengths and challenges were. And I was wondering in that process, were there any particular books or resources that really inspired you or helped you learn how to do that? Or is it truly just sort of a self-directed inquiry?
Yeah, really good question. Thank you for asking that. So the chairs of medicine, the National Chairs of Medicine group, it's called the Association of Professors of Medicine. They have a what's called a New Chairs and Emerging Leaders program. And I've gone to it for like 25 years. I ran the course for a while. I still teach in it and speak in it, but I went for years and years and years beyond the time I was a new leader because I loved hearing other people's formulation of leadership. And at times I would hear things and I'd say, oh my God, why didn't I think of that? I've been doing this all wrong. And my initial reaction was embarrassment and maybe even a little shame, but then I copied them. So that to me was incredibly important. And then over the years, I've worked with consultants who've come into organizations that I've been in who talked about leadership or talked about organizational performance. And I've often taken advantage of time talking to them offline about issues. I think the biggest epiphany for me was when I realized that leadership was learnable. I think coming to grips with that for me was really transformational. I would have told you when I took my first leadership positions that being a good leader was innate. You had certain personalities or characteristics, and you are who you are, you're hardwired, and some people are capable of leading and some aren't. And, that's how I thought about leadership for, the first probably 3 decades of my life. And then I started to realize that, leaders are often mentorless. Leaders often who get mentorship and leaders who get advice and who are deliberate and inquisitive grow more, and that there's a science behind leadership. And I read several books on it. Most of them I found I could only read about half of them because it's like reading a book of statistics after a while. You get tired of it. But I think just recognizing that you can learn and you should learn, and that, I've been a chair for 28 years, and I just came back from a New Chairs Emerging Leaders program where I spoke. And I will tell you, I probably learned 5 new things about how to be a better department chair. Now you could say, well, you're just a slow learner. It took you 28 years and you're still learning. But I would venture to say that's true of probably most of the people who are in leadership positions. But those receptors have to be open. You have to recognize that you need some humility in order to be effective. And I think I can't claim that I've had that throughout my career. I had a start to it that I wasn't so thrilled about, and I had a tendency to get in love with my own ideas, and I learned the hard way that you can't do that.
Do you have to be a good scientist to be a good leader? I see that as fraught with difficulty in my environment. Yeah, I think we've all known good scientists who were terrible leaders and so-so scientists who were good leaders. So I think probably not. I think, there was a really important part of my career where I spent most of my time doing research and thinking like a scientist. I think it helped me in many different ways in thinking about data quality, data acquisition, time frame for understanding how to make good decisions, how to communicate with clarity. Those were really, really important. And then also about how to support people who were doing science in their career. So I would say it's a really beneficial, important part of the training of being a leader. But I don't think being a good scientist means you're a good leader. And I do think you can be a better leader if you've had science experience in an organization that does science.
particularly because science applauds continual learning and continual reflection and
Yes.
learning from the data and improving for the future. So
Exactly. Yeah,
that's fantastic.
it's a very, very important perspective to have as a leader. You also I think you can't do science and not have some sense of humility. And I think, that's important as a leader also.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Coleman, I want to thank you. This has been empowering and inspirational. We really appreciate your messages and you taking the time out to talk to us and for your work in propelling women leaders. It's really wonderful. Thank you again so much. And thank you to Dr. Corkey for the wonderful interview.
Thank you all for doing this. This has been
Yes.
fun.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it and appreciate the chance.